Hello, my name is Grandmaster Daniel Gormally. I want to talk a little bit about the England team, about the selection for the England team, because there's a couple of interesting points that we made on social media. And I want to talk about really some of the issues that are being brought up. So just to explain, I believe the England Euro chess team, the England chess team will be playing in European Championships in Montenegro in November. I think the women's team is something like Harriet Hunt, Jovanka Huska, Yan Lau, Katerina Toma, and Akshaya. Not sure how you pronounce her surname, is it? Anyway, that's essentially the women's team. The men's team is Nikita Vitigov, originally from Russia, now playing for England. Michael Adams, sorry, David Howe on board too. Michael Adams and the other two players are Luke McShane and Rabih Harir. Now, a few people have basically suggested that they feel that Vitiyugov is taking away a place from the men's team. Now, I'm going to try and talk about this argument and try and discuss this argument and really explain, I think, why Vitiyugov has been brought in. Now, in my opinion, English chess has declined in recent years. I think there's several reasons for that. I want to talk about the reasons why we've declined. I think if you go back to the 1970s, there was a golden generation of English players that came through. I've recently been reading in the English Chess Moves, which is the ECF magazine. You can find it online, or it's also published in kind of magazine format as well. So John Nunn's been writing a series on older players from the past, like people like Hugh Alexander and Vera Menchik, Jonathan Penrose. Now, in my opinion, those players will not compare strength-wise with the players who emerged from the 1970s onwards. So we're talking about Miles, Spielman, even Ray Keane, John Nunn, Murray Chandler. He had Matthew Sadler, and of course he had at really the top of the tree, had Nigel Short, who the first was the number one until Michael Adams came along, and essentially he's been like the English version of Vishy Anand, where he's dominated English chess for 35 odd years, you know, going back to 1989 really. So you're talking about a period of my maths aren't very good, but it's a long period, maybe not 35 years, it's certainly over 30 years that he's been at the top of the tree. And but now we're starting to, obviously these players are getting older. So Mark Adams is not going to be at the top of the tree forever. So we need a new generation to replace it. Now, after that generation, we also had Luke McShane came along, and then we had David Howe and Gawain Jones, are all 2600 plus players. Now, in my opinion, this current generation of players, although they're very strong players, don't get me wrong, is the first generation of players where we've not had a player over 2600 for many, many years. Now, why is that? I want to explain why I think that is, and why there's several reasons for our decline as a chess nation. I'll try not to bore you to death too much going into the detail. I think firstly that the generation we just talked about were uniquely motivated group of players. Travelled around a lot. I think expenses were less. It was easier to travel back in those days. You didn't have things like Brexit. If I wanted to go away and play a tournament now in Europe, it probably cost me a lot of money. For example, there was a tournament in Portugal recently I was thinking about playing. It would cost me, I thought, the best part of £2,000 just to play in it. The first prize was something like €2,000. There were no expenses for myself. Probably if someone like Adams got in contact with the organiser, he would have got conditions. But we're talking about young and up and coming players. How do they improve? How do they get better? The motivation for them to get better isn't that great. You look at the weekend circuit in England now. It's not great. I just recently played a tournament in Hull. I won a £50 prize. my total expenses, if you simply include the train ticket, was around about £100. So I made a £50 loss. So you clearly see that being a professional chess player is not a very good career move. And if you're a sort of like, let's say you're a 19, 20-year-old young, improving 2450, 2500 player, and you have the choice between becoming a professional chess player or essentially getting a job working in a bank, and you might be on £100,000 in a few years, it's a bit of a no-brainer. You're going to get that job working in the bank, right? Because the money in chess is so horrifically bad. Now, part of the reason I think this is why Malcolm Payne has made this effort to bring in this money from the government and also bring in extra players from abroad, because essentially he's beefing up the UK chess team. He's making that a more professional, more competitive team, and you can also pay more money to the players who are already on the team. So therefore you then have a motivation that if you're good enough to get on the team, you're going to get rewarded, and therefore you can continue as a professional player. You know, if you look at a country like Iceland, they pay their grandmasters, you know, something in the region of £25,000 a year to play as a chess grandmaster, for example. We don't have that in that country. So essentially, if you're a chess player, you're on your own. Now that worked back in the 1970s, 1980s, because we had, as I said, we had a uniquely motivated group of players. But now we don't really have that. We don't have a kind of a setup. I don't think we have a very professional coaching setup in this country either. You know, if you look at countries like India, why they've improved so much, it's partly due to the fact that they've all been inspired by Vishy, and there's been a chess boom. It's partly due to the huge population they have in India. They have a huge talent pool to choose from, and they all kind of inspire each other and bring themselves on. In a way, that's kind of like a larger, I would say, example of what happened in the English chess boom. It's on a larger scale. What originally happened, you know, you suddenly saying all these kind of talents come through at the same time. You have Gukesh, you have Praggnanandhaa. But yeah, when I remember talking to somebody and they said they were a coach or they were a player or something at one of these World Junior Championships, and the Indian players would go after the game. The junior players would go after the game and spend 3-4 hours, you know, outside going over the game with the coach. So I don't think we have that kind of drive or motivation in this country, which is understandable in a way, because, you know, the general thing is, if you're a junior player, you really work hard at it for many, many years. When you're young, you've got all that fantastic motivation. When you become older, you essentially drift out of chess and you get a different profession, because you realise that being a professional chess player is a waste of time, or your motivation, you've got what you've achieved, you've got the IM title, the GM title, whatever. You know, I look at some of the kids coming through now and I think, well, they're born like, you know, typical pairing now in an open is you're playing someone who's born in 2007, 2008, 2009. Does that mean I'll have to give up playing professional chess in 4 or 5 years? Quite possibly. But on the other hand, when they get older, they don't necessarily improve as much as you think. And they also, they essentially drift out of chess. So you're not necessarily having to play them anymore. Then you're dealing with kids who were born in 2014, 2015. I think if they all stayed around, then it would just almost become impossible to play, because the standard would be so high, and you'd be competing over a very, very dwindling pot of money, which is essentially the case as it is, but it would become even worse. So another thing I wanted to discuss was the selection, but I've got to be careful about this, because going back in the day, I remember in the Turin Olympiad, which was a controversial episode for me to say the least, but I remember before that, Danny King and Murray Chandler were talking about how they probably should have been picked ahead of Nick Pert and Stuart Conquest. Now I remember that kind of annoyed me at the time, and I was like, you know, this isn't really a very good thing. I felt like they were undermining the players who were on the team, and I didn't really feel like they were like 2600 plus at that point. So I didn't really feel like they had a great argument. They didn't really play that much. Obviously, don't get me wrong, they're very good players. Obviously, they're GMs like myself. They're extremely good players, extremely talented players. Murray Chandler's played for England on a number of occasions in the past. Danny King's a fantastic commentator. But yeah, I got into a little bit of trouble with that because I saw Danny King later and he said hello at 4NCL, I think it was, in Sunningdale, and I kind of blanked him. I was walking on with Dave Ledger on the Saturday morning, and he hasn't spoken to me since. So you reap what you sow. Anyway, the point I'm trying to make is I've got to be careful what I say about the selection. Now, Viti Ugov, I believe, was brought in to help make England more competitive, and I think we should welcome bringing players in. On the other hand, you could also make the argument, a lot of people are making this argument on social media, that if you're bringing in too many players, that is taking up the place of people who were born in this country. I certainly feel that I would have been annoyed round about back in 2005, 2006. If I'd have had a chance to play for England, I had a chance to play for England at that point. And if that had been taken away from me by the fact that we'd suddenly brought in a load of, players from abroad. But one player on their own isn't necessarily a sign that we're going to bring in loads of players and force everybody out on the team. I certainly hope that that isn't the case. And I think partly that Viti Ugov was brought in to help the juniors improve. We've seen that we're not competitive in this country. This generation that we have in a moment does not compare with the players that we had in the past. So therefore, or the younger generation I should say, obviously the players who are already established, people like David Howe, Luke McShane, they're 2600 plus. I'm talking really about the younger generation, none of whom are 2600 plus. They're good players, don't get me wrong, but they're not at that level. So Viti Ugov is brought in to maybe reverse that trend and hopefully bring some of the even younger players who are maybe 10, 11, 12, 13 now to that level. People like Sheriff Royal, for example, who's I think he's about 14 and potentially a future Super GM. And but there was also a little bit of controversy on the lower boards because Ravi Harir was picked ahead of people like Daniel Fernandez and Ami Gartzi. Now, I played Ravi Harir, who, in my opinion, is one of the most naturally talented players I've ever faced. I said this to his mum when I played him in a tournament, an E2E4 event, which, funnily enough, I think was also in Sunningdale. And I remember thinking that he was incredibly naturally gifted. He's a very, very good player. And I think him and Fernandez and Ami are all roughly about the same level. There's also Nick Pert, who's around about that level as well. Jonathan Hawkins, who doesn't play anymore, is slightly high rated. But he's also an inactive player. The only argument you could make is that potentially maybe Fernandez could have got picked instead. Because of the fact that he's been playing a lot recently over the last year. Fernandez is also a very good player. Another player I've got a bad record against. So all these players like Marcus Harvey, Fernandez, Ravi Harir, Ami, I just have a bad record against, you know. Actually, Ami I used to have quite a decent record against, but it's got worse in recent years. But yeah, I feel like the reason I would say that Daniel potentially may have been picked over Ravi was the fact that he's been very active over the last year. He's played a lot of chess. And I feel that in that situation, if you were in that situation, you played like a huge amount of tournament games, then you didn't get picked. You kind of feel like, what am I actually doing wrong? What do I have to do to actually get picked, right? Because this other player hasn't played at all. But on the other hand, I've got to be careful what I say, because I know from personal experience, it's very tough playing for England. And there's a huge amount of pressure every time you play. And you don't want to increase that pressure on that person. I don't think Ravi is going to play every game, right? So the games that he's going to come in, he's going to be under a lot of pressure to play well. And when he has played for England before, he's played really well. And I do believe that he's got an advantage over people like Fernandez and Ami, who's also played very well over the last year. Ravi's got an advantage in the sense that he's played for England before. But it is an honour to play for England, in my opinion. You know, it's something to remember. I think it would be a bit sad if people like Fernandez and Ami never got a chance to play for England. So it'd be interesting to see if they carry on their form over the next few years and whether they get that chance. As far as the qualification for playing for England is concerned, I'm not sure how the selection is done, because it's essentially on a choice basis. There's no qualification as far as I'm aware. If they turn it into a qualification event, you could have a situation where, let's say it's a one-off tournament to qualify for the England team. Let's say, I don't know, Luke McShane plays and has a shocker. And suddenly, like myself, I'll qualify. I don't think anyone would be particularly happy about that. I like play by myself, or somebody else, 2450, gets ahead of McShane. So there is a question there about the qualification and how you pick the team. I believe there was an England selection committee in the past. But I think that at the moment, I'm not sure if that's still taking place. I believe people like Jonathan Parker and Harriet Hunt were part of the selection committee. I'm not sure if that still takes place. But I feel like they should essentially have some kind of automatic qualifying place to kind of remove this argument. So if you left one place open to qualify for, then somebody could say, look, at least you've got a place there and it's done fairly. Rather than, I feel like with someone like Fernandez, he's kind of been shortchanged. He's played everywhere. He's played really well in the British Championships. I played him in a tournament in Ghent. He beat me there. He played in America. He's played Hans Niemann. He's played everywhere. And now, if you're in that situation and you're not getting picked over somebody who hasn't played an entire year, I think you've got kind of a legitimate kind of beef there, right? And I'd imagine it was no phone call. There was no kind of phone call. Like, if you play for the England team, I remember there's a famous story with Gazza trashing a hotel room because Glenn Hoddle told him he wasn't in the team. But I don't believe in England, if you don't get selected, if you get close to selection, you're going to get a phone call. So, but essentially, it's just this kind of cold feeling that you weren't good enough. And yeah, it's a difficult one because I feel that all deserve a chance to play. Hopefully, Ravi will play really well. He's a really talented player. It's a lot of pressure on him to play well when he does come into the team. Hopefully, he'll be able to handle it. He's a really nice guy as well. But yeah, it's an awkward one because you kind of feel like there doesn't seem to be a fair selection process. Or it's just not very transparent, shall we say. So these are my thoughts on the England team. I'm sure I'll be doing more videos on this going forward. There's also the England women's team as well, where we've had players come in from abroad as well, which has essentially made it very difficult to get in the England women's team for homegrown players like Zoe Varney, who could potentially play for England as well. So that's also an issue as well. But be interested to see how we do and whether we have a better performance with Nikita Vitiugov in the team.